My best friend called me jealous for skipping her $9,000 birthday to sit by my dying granddad, then showed up at his celebration screaming about revenge. When I told her there's a baby at risk, she rolled her eyes and said, "Now you're making my birthday about you?" I just walked away. That was 2 years ago. Yesterday, she left a $50,000 check on my porch without saying a word. I was sitting in the ICU painting my granddad's nails when the nurses told me he only had days left to live. My parents died when I was 8, and he was the only family I had. That's when I felt a vibration on my inner thigh. It was a call from my best friend Bianca. "Hey, so what are you wearing to my birthday tomorrow night?" "Oh, I don't think I'll be able to come," I responded. I felt like a terrible friend for canceling so last minute, but I had no choice. "Are you freaking serious right now? What will everyone think when my best friend isn't at my party? You have to come." "Bianca, my granddad's dying. I've kept it private, but—" "Oh my gosh," she interrupted. "Now you're making my birthday about you? My parents literally spent $9,000 on party supplies alone. Just admit you're jealous that you're broke, and I'm turning 21 first." Luckily, I had AirPods in so my granddad couldn't hear her BS, and I hung up. She started spamming me with texts that were even worse than her call, but I felt like a petty hoe that day. So I made a group chat of our entire friend group without her, and sent every screenshot. Mia called immediately. "Babe, I'm so sorry about your granddad. Also, Bianca's canceled. But listen, I have an idea that's downright evil." Within an hour, my granddad's hospice waiting room was filled with young girls determined to cheer him up. "Girl," Mia announced, "F Bianca's birthday party. I want your granddad to be happy." My eyes welled up with tears as I realized every other girl in our friend group felt the same way. I wasn't even mad at Bianca for leaking my secret. That's when Tori jumped in. "My mom owns that catering company. She'll donate everything for your granddad's final party. I'll make a Facebook event," said Sienna. "Private at first, then public an hour before." "Wait," said Jess, showing her phone. "Bianca's already posting about her exclusive VIP list. She's bragging about how selective she's being." "Perfect. Let's be even more exclusive. Celebrating Harold's beautiful life final gathering." The planning was intricate. We created shifts so Grandad wouldn't be overwhelmed. "I'll coordinate transportation for all his elderly friends," Ashley volunteered. "My boyfriend's in a jazz quartet. They'll play for free," added Tori. The group chat was fire. Everyone Bianca had invited was asking subtle questions. Not about her, but about my granddad. "Hey, did you hear about OP's granddad? Is it true he raised her alone? Was he really a war hero?" The answer to all their questions was yes. BTW LOL. By Thursday, Bianca was panicking in her stories. "Reminder, my party requires RSVP, exclusive guest list only," but people were already choosing. Her own cousin messaged me, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandfather sounds like an amazing person. I'll be there." Friday night, Mia texted, "Check Bianca's story. She'd posted a poll. Who's coming tomorrow?" Only 12% said yes, LOL. Then she posted, "Quality over quantity. Intimate vibes only." We didn't respond. We were too busy setting up the hospice common room with hundreds of battery-powered candles, memory boards spanning 8 decades, and flowers from his own garden. Saturday morning came too fast. I woke up in the chair beside Granddad's bed, my hand still holding his. He was awake, just watching me with those kind eyes that had watched me grow up. "Big day, pumpkin," he whispered. I couldn't speak, just nodded, tears already forming. The nurses helped me get him ready. His best cardigan, the one Grandma knitted him 40 years ago. His hands shook as I helped him with the buttons. "I might not see everyone," he started, then stopped. We both knew what he meant. He might not see everyone again. "You will," I lied, fixing his collar. "You're the strongest person I know." By 7 p.m., the common room was transformed. The fairy lights made everything glow soft and golden. The jazz quartet was warming up quietly. Almost everyone who was invited to Bianca's party had chosen my granddad's gathering over hers. His war buddy wheeled in first. They just looked at each other and started crying. Then came his first student from 1967, now a grandmother herself. Each person who walked in made Granddad's eyes water more. "All this fuss for me?" he kept saying, but his voice was thick with emotion. "You deserve everything," I whispered. At 8:47 p.m., my phone exploded. It was Bianca. "Where is everyone?" Even my cousin ditched. Then, "I know you did something." At 9:23 p.m., the doors burst open. Bianca stood there in her birthday tiara and designer dress, mascara streaking. The jazz stopped. Everyone turned. "How dare you?" she started. "Bianca," someone's grandmother said firmly, "this is a celebration of life. Please be respectful." She saw the photos, the war medals, the teaching awards, the 100 people who'd chosen love over her party. "This is, you ruined." My granddad, sweet as ever, patted the chair beside him. "You must be Bianca. I saved you some cake." She looked at him, at me, at everyone staring at her with disappointment. Then she ran. "Just you freaking wait and see when I get my revenge." At the time, I just rolled my eyes, blissfully unaware of the secrets that rich bitches like her were hiding. The morning after Granddad's celebration, my phone buzzed so hard it fell off the nightstand. I grabbed it and saw 47 missed calls from Bianca, plus a voicemail that made my stomach drop. Her voice was ice cold, saying my mom was already calling the hospice board about our unauthorized gathering, and that Granddad would enjoy his last days with new restrictions. My hands shook as I watched the hospice director walking straight toward Granddad's room carrying a stack of official-looking paperwork. She knocked and entered while I scrambled to follow her inside. The director looked at the complaint form, then at Granddad sleeping peacefully, and did something I didn't expect. She tore the papers in half and dropped them in the trash. She told me Granddad taught her daughter 30 years ago, and some complaints weren't worth the paper they were written on, but she warned me the Whitmores donated heavily to the hospital foundation, and I needed to be careful because they had real influence here. I spent the next 3 days barely leaving Granddad's side, holding his hand while reading him stories his former students had sent. His grip got weaker each day until I could barely feel it anymore. Mia brought me coffee every morning and just sat there quietly because we both knew there was nothing to say that would help. Thursday morning, I checked my phone and saw Bianca had posted on Instagram about people using dying relatives for attention and calling it pathetic. Within 10 minutes, our entire friend group had unfollowed her, and the screenshots were already spreading everywhere. She deleted it fast, but her own cousin messaged me saying Bianca was getting worse and I should be careful. Day 5 at the hospice, Granddad could barely open his eyes, but he grabbed my hand and whispered something about Bianca and her family being broken. He said he saw it at parent conferences years ago, but I didn't understand what he meant. I recorded it on my phone because these were his last coherent words about anything beyond our family. The hospice billing office called that afternoon saying someone tried to cancel Granddad's insurance authorization. situation. They traced the call to a number registered to Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, which was Bianca's mother's company. The billing clerk sounded really uncomfortable, admitting this wasn't the first time they'd had issues with that family. Granddad's breathing changed that night, and the nurses explained about something called Cheney-Stokes breathing that meant his body was shutting down. I counted the seconds between each breath while Mia's mom brought me a blanket and homemade soup I couldn't even look at. A delivery arrived the next morning, and it was a single white rose with a card that said, "For the soon-to-be orphan," signed with just a B. The security guard saw my face and quietly pocketed the card, saying he'd keep it if I needed it later, because that was crossing a line. Granddad's former colleague showed up with a box of his things from the school that had been in storage for years. Inside were parent conference notes from 2010 to 2015, and the Whitmore file was thicker than any other family's. The notes mentioned inappropriate pressure on other families and concerns about Victoria's pharmaceutical connections going back years. Day 8 at the hospice, I couldn't sleep and kept waking up every time Granddad's breathing changed or stopped. The overnight nurse brought me tea at 3 a.m. and mentioned she'd worked at 3 other facilities where the Whitmores had caused problems for families they didn't like. Around 5 that morning, Granddad's breathing got really weird and choppy. I grabbed his hand and his eyes suddenly opened, clearer than they'd been in weeks. He looked right at me and squeezed my hand tight. His voice came out rough but strong when he said the house had papers in the basement behind the water heater and I needed to be careful. He told me he loved me and squeezed my hand 3 times, which was our special code since I was 8 years old. I squeezed back 3 times and watched his face relax into a small smile. The machine started beeping different at 6:47 a.m. and I felt his hand go slack in mine. His chest stopped moving and the last little pulse in his wrist just faded away under my fingers. The nurse came in and checked him with her stethoscope and wrote down 6:52 on her clipboard. While they were pulling the sheet up over his face, I saw movement in the hallway. Bianca was standing there with her mother Victoria, who was wearing a business suit at 7 in the morning. Victoria looked right at me and smiled this cold little smile before they walked away down the corridor. 3 days later, while I was trying to pick out flowers, the funeral home director called me. How did the nurses know exactly when to tear up those papers? Did they already know something bad about Bianca's family? The way Granddad squeezed her hand 3 times makes me wonder if that was their secret code for years and years. Someone had called them claiming Granddad owed the Whitmores money, and they were contesting the funeral payment. The director said he'd known Granddad for 30 years and would handle everything anyway, but this was legally weird. I drove to Granddad's house for the first time since he died and just sat in the driveway for 10 minutes. Walking in hit me hard because everything smelled like him, that mix of Old Spice and coffee that meant home. His favorite cardigan was still draped over his chair and I couldn't make myself move it. I went down to the basement and found the water heater in the corner. Behind it was a metal filing cabinet I'd never seen before with a padlock on it. I used bolt cutters from the garage and inside were 7 manila folders with names I didn't recognize. Each folder had pharmacy records from different Whitmore stores with certain medications circled in red pen. Granddad's handwriting was all over the margins with notes about dosages being increased without doctor approval. One folder showed how a generic drug got switched to brand name and the price jumped 400%. Mia came over that afternoon to help me figure out funeral stuff and saw the folders spread across the kitchen table. She picked one up and her face went white when she read the name Rosa Martinez. She told me that was her aunt who died last year and went to a Whitmore pharmacy. Her aunt's medications kept changing and she got really confused in her last months. The estate lawyer called while we were sitting there and said someone filed a claim against Granddad's estate. They wanted $47,000 for unpaid pharmaceutical consulting fees, which made no sense. The claim was signed by Victoria Whitmore personally and dated the day after Granddad died. A week after he passed, we had the funeral at the small chapel he'd picked out years ago. I was halfway through my eulogy when Bianca walked in wearing a white dress like she was going to a party. She sat in the back row texting, and every time I got emotional, she'd fake cough really loud. Through the window, I could see her mom's Mercedes idling in the parking lot with the engine running. After the service, Granddad's war buddy grabbed my arm and pulled me aside near the coat room. He told me Harold had been investigating something before he got sick, and if anything happened, I should find Billy Stewart at the hospital. He said Billy was a social worker who'd been documenting things for months. I met Billy at a coffee shop downtown 3 days later, and he kept looking over his shoulder the whole time. He was sweating even though it was cold, and his hands shook when he picked up his cup. He told me Granddad had contacted him 6 months ago about elderly patients at Whitmore pharmacies. They'd been tracking 7 deaths where medications got changed without doctor approval, and every single estate got drained by medical debt afterward. Billy kept checking his phone and said he had to go, but gave me a folder with copies of everything he'd found and told me to be careful because these people had connections everywhere. 3 days later, I was at the grocery store getting milk and bread when Victoria appeared right behind me at the pharmacy counter where I was picking up my birth control. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and pulled me close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with wine, even though it was only noon. Her voice was low and mean when she said my grandfather was a meddling old fool, and I was following in his footsteps, and if I didn't drop this whole thing, I'd lose more than just a house. The pharmacist behind the counter watched the whole thing with wide eyes, and after Victoria stormed off, she slipped me a folded piece of paper when she handed me my prescription bag. I didn't read it until I got to my car, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely unfold it, but it said she'd been forced to change prescriptions for elderly customers, and she had records if I needed them. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and it was the estate lawyer sounding really stressed. He said Victoria had filed paperwork for power of attorney over Granddad's entire estate and was claiming I was mentally unstable due to grief and couldn't handle the responsibility. The hearing was in 3 days, and even though he said it was completely baseless, I had to show up, or I'd risk a default judgment that would give her control of everything Granddad left me. I spent the rest of that day at Granddad's house going through more of his papers and trying not to cry when I saw his handwriting on everything. The garden out back was getting overgrown, and his tomato plants were dying, so I grabbed the watering can and spent an hour trying to save them. His gardening journal was sitting on the potting bench, and I flipped through it while the plants soaked up the water. Between notes about when to plant beans and how much fertilizer to use for the roses, there were other notes written in pencil that made my stomach drop. One from 2 months ago said VW visited again today, and another said threatened nursing home if I don't cooperate, and the worst one just said must protect others from her. That night, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I got a text from an unknown number that just said, "This is Linda Whitmore. more, and I need to talk to you about my mom. My heart started racing because Linda was Bianca's younger sister who was only 19 and still lived at home. She said her mom didn't know she was contacting me, and she'd found something in her home office about my grandfather and other elderly people that I needed to see. She asked if we could meet at the college library the next day and promised she'd explain everything. I barely slept that night and showed up at the library 15 minutes early with my hands sweating and my heart pounding. Linda was already there in a back corner study room looking scared and kept checking over her shoulder like someone might be following her. She pulled out a flash drive with shaking hands and pushed it across the table to me. Her voice was barely a whisper when she told me there were emails on it about her mom targeting elderly customers who owned property, and she'd been marking them as phase 1 through phase 3 based on their health status. My grandfather had been marked phase 3, which meant terminal, and there were 6 other names on the same list. She looked like she might throw up when she said Bianca didn't know how deep this went, and her mom had been doing this for years. 2 days later, I had to go to the competency hearing, and Victoria showed up with 3 people I'd never seen before who all claimed they'd witnessed me acting erratically since Grandad's death. One woman said she'd seen me talking to myself at the grocery store, and a man claimed I'd been screaming at people in the parking lot of Grandad's nursing home, which was complete BS because I hadn't even been there since he died. The judge looked suspicious and kept asking them for specific dates and times which they couldn't provide, but he still scheduled a full hearing in 2 weeks to investigate further. Detective Ray was sitting in the back row taking notes the whole time and caught my eye when Victoria's witnesses stumbled over their stories. That night, I plugged in the flash drive Linda gave me and spent hours going through spreadsheets titled Estate Acquisition Project that made me want to throw up. There were 7 names that matched the folders in Grandad's filing cabinet with columns showing their home values and something called Medication Adjustment Schedule that showed when each person's prescriptions got changed. Every single person who died had their medications switched 6 to 8 months before their death, and the changes created side effects that required expensive treatments that drained their savings. The next evening, Mia invited me over for dinner with her family, and her grandmother pulled me aside after we ate. She held my hands tight and told me Grandad had been so proud of me, and he knew something was wrong but wanted to protect me from it. Then she went to her bedroom and came back with Grandad's old lesson plan book that he'd lent her years ago for her tutoring business. Inside the front cover were more notes in his handwriting about Victoria visiting elderly customers and pressuring them to change their insurance plans and medications. 3 days after that, I came home from spending the afternoon at Grandad's house organizing his things and knew immediately something was wrong because my door was slightly open, even though I always double-check the lock. Nothing was stolen, but every single photo of Grandad in my apartment was turned face down, and there was an empty pharmacy pill bottle sitting on my pillow with my name on it for a medication I'd never heard of. The prescription date on the label was tomorrow, which made no sense, and the prescribing doctor's name was someone I'd never been to. I called Ray immediately, and he came over with 2 other officers to dust for fingerprints and take photos of everything. He officially opened an investigation that night, but warned me the Whitmores had connections throughout the city, and they'd know within hours that police were looking into them. He assigned a patrol car to drive by my apartment twice a day and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop with texts from people I hadn't talked to in years. Billy had done it. The local news was running a story about elderly deaths connected to Whitmore pharmacy customers, and my phone screen showed 14 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I turned on the TV, and there was Victoria in her perfect suit denying everything, but her hands were shaking, and she kept touching her pearl necklace the way people do when they're lying. My phone rang again, and it was another family whose grandmother died after switching to Whitmore pharmacies 6 months ago. Why did Victoria pick that exact moment in the grocery store to threaten her? Was she following her around, or does she have people watching? Then another call about someone's dad who went from healthy to dead in 3 weeks after they changed his heart medication. I started writing down all their names and stories in Grandad's old notebook while watching Victoria stumble through her interview. 3 days later, Linda texted me to meet her at the park near the old elementary school, and when I got there, she was sitting with some guy in a hoodie who kept looking around nervously. He worked IT at Whitmore Corporate and had been copying their servers for weeks because he couldn't stand what they were doing anymore. He showed me printouts of an actual algorithm on his laptop that selected targets based on age, property ownership, and how many family members they had. The fewer relatives, the higher the score. My granddad had figured it out months ago, according to the timestamps on his research. That afternoon, I went back to Granddad's house to pack more of his things and found his Bible on the nightstand with a bookmark sticking out. Inside was a letter dated exactly 1 week before he died, and my hands shook as I read his careful handwriting telling me not to let anger eat me up, to use the law and the community and the truth because they prey on people who are alone. I was crying so hard I almost didn't notice the house was freezing cold until I tried to turn on the heat and nothing happened. The power was off, and so was the water. When I called the utility company, they said there was a $15,000 balance from commercial medical equipment charges, which made no sense because Grandad always paid his bills 2 weeks early and never had any commercial equipment. Ray called while I was still arguing with the utility company, and his voice was different, serious in a way that made my stomach drop. They'd found records of a journalist named David Park who investigated Victoria 3 years ago and died in a car accident 2 weeks after confronting her about the pharmacy deaths. His editor still had all his notes and wanted to meet with us. 3 days later at the town hall meeting about healthcare costs, I watched Maria Martinez stand up in the middle of Victoria's presentation about affordable medicine and start shouting about how Whitmore killed her mother with fake prescriptions. Then another person stood up, then another, and suddenly the whole room was chaos with families yelling about their dead relatives, while security guards rushed Victoria out the back door. That night, the pharmacist who'd slipped me the note months ago called from a blocked number and said she'd been documenting forced prescription changes for 2 years and had recordings of Victoria threatening to destroy any pharmacist who didn't comply with the new protocols. She had 12 other pharmacists ready to testify if I could guarantee their protection somehow. I spent the next day at Granddad's house packing his bedroom and trying not to cry at every little thing, like his reading glasses still sitting on his book or his slippers perfectly lined up by the bed. In his wallet, I found a photo of me at 8 years old, the day he became my guardian after my parents died, and behind it was a business card for an FBI agent with a note in Granddad's writing that said to call this number if something happened to him. My hands were shaking as I dialed and left a voicemail. 4 days later, Bianca cornered me at the coffee shop downtown, her face red and her designer bag bag clutched so tight her knuckles were white. She kept saying I was destroying her family and her mom was just a businesswoman. But when I showed her the folder with all the evidence about the deaths, her voice got smaller and smaller until she was whispering that her mom would never do something like that. Even though I could see in her eyes she was starting to believe it. The FBI agent called back that afternoon, and Agent Sarah Kim said Grandad had contacted her 6 months ago, but didn't have enough evidence for them to act on it then. But with everything we had now, plus the interstate commerce angle, she could open a federal investigation into medical fraud and possibly murder. My phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Linda was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She kept saying her mom found out about us talking and was sending her to Switzerland on the first flight tomorrow. She'd left a box of documents with campus security that had everything from her mom's personal files. She said she was sorry about my grandfather, and that he was trying to save people before the line went dead. I threw on clothes and drove to campus in the dark while calling Mia to meet me there. The security guard knew me from all my late study nights and handed over the cardboard box without questions. My hands shook as I opened it in the parking lot under a streetlight. Inside were printed emails between Victoria and someone named Dr. Morrison discussing adjusted death certificates for 7 elderly patients. One email from 6 months ago made me drop the papers. Victoria had written about Harold getting too close and needing to accelerate his timeline. I took photos of everything with my phone while Mia held the flashlight. We drove straight to Detective Ray's house even though it was 4 in the morning. He answered the door in his bathrobe and actually listened this time as we spread the papers across his kitchen table. By noon, Victoria had filed a $2 million defamation lawsuit against me. The same afternoon, my lawyer called saying the estate claim had jumped to $150,000. She said Victoria was trying to bury me in legal fees because desperate people make these kinds of moves when they're scared. I noticed the white van the next morning parked outside Mia's apartment where I'd been staying. It followed us to the grocery store, then to campus, then back home for 3 straight days. On the 3rd day, I walked right up to the driver's window at a red light and knocked hard. The guy inside claimed he was a private investigator hired to document my mental instability for the lawsuit. Mia filmed him admitting he'd been photographing me through windows and following me everywhere. We sent the video to Agent Kim, who called Detective Ray immediately. They'd been coordinating their investigations and found Whitmore had been doing this in 3 different states. Agent Kim said they'd identified over 40 suspicious deaths that matched the same pattern. She told me this wasn't just about my grandfather anymore, but had become a serial murder investigation. Billy started a Facebook group for families who'd lost someone at Whitmore facilities. Within 2 days, we had over 100 members sharing their stories about sudden declines and mysterious medication changes. We decided to create a website called Whitmore Victims United with all our evidence organized by date and location. The site crashed within 4 hours from too much traffic as 147 families uploaded their documents. Victoria sent cease and desist letters to everyone, but her own lawyer withdrew from representing her, citing ethical concerns. Billy and I took everything to the state attorney general's office with 3 boxes of printed evidence. She reviewed it for 2 hours while we sat in her waiting room drinking terrible coffee. When she called us back in, she said she was issuing immediate subpoenas for all Whitmore pharmaceutical records. She said if even half of what we showed her was true, this would be the largest healthcare fraud case in state history. I couldn't sleep at Grandad's house anymore because everything reminded me of him. My own apartment felt unsafe after the private investigator incident, so I stayed at Mia's place. I woke up at 3 in the morning thinking I heard Grandad calling my name from the living room. Mia found me standing in her kitchen just staring at nothing and crying. She held me while I shook and promised we were going to get justice because Grandad knew I could do this. The next morning, Bianca posted a video on Instagram wearing designer clothes in her mansion. She said her family was being persecuted by jealous losers who couldn't accept their relatives died naturally. Within an hour, Linda posted her own video from some fancy boarding school in Switzerland. She looked straight at the camera and said her mother was a murderer with proof to back it up. She apologized for everyone her family had hurt and said she'd testify if needed. 3 days later, the FBI showed up at Whitmore Pharmaceutical at 6 in the morning with a warrant. They raided Victoria's house at the exact same time with news helicopters circling overhead filming everything. Agents carried out dozens of boxes while neighbors stood on their lawns recording with their phones. Victoria got photographed in handcuffs being led to a black SUV in her silk pajamas and slippers. She posted $5 million bail and was out within 4 hours. But the damage was done. Every news channel ran the footage of her arrest on repeat, while the story went viral online. My phone rang at 6 in the morning 2 days later, and Ray sounded different this time, like he couldn't believe what he was about to say. David's widow had just walked into the police station with a box of old cassette tapes her husband had secretly recorded of Victoria, talking about removing obstacles, and my granddad's name was right there on one of them from 3 months before he died. The FBI agents came to my apartment within an hour and played me the recording where Victoria's voice was clear as day, saying Harold was becoming a problem, and asking David if there were ways to speed up natural processes without leaving traces. My hands shook so bad I dropped my coffee mug, and it shattered on the floor while the agents kept writing notes about attempted murder and conspiracy charges. That same afternoon, they arrested the medical examiner who'd signed Granddad's death certificate, and he started talking before they even got him to the station, telling them about every single death certificate he'd changed for Victoria and showing them bank records of the $50,000 payments she'd made him. The IT guy with the hoodie actually had an algorithm that scored people based on how many relatives they had. That's such a strange way to pick targets. I wonder if Victoria created it herself or hired someone to make it work that way. The paperwork got changed that week from natural causes to suspicious circumstances pending investigation, and I finally had proof that Grandad didn't just die peacefully in his sleep like everyone kept telling me. 3 weeks later, on day 58, I held the memorial service Grandad deserved at the community center with over 300 people showing up, including students he'd taught 40 years ago who drove from different states just to be there. Each person stood up and told a story about how he'd help them, like the single mom he'd tutored for free so she could get her GED, or the kid he'd paid for lunch every day for 3 years without anyone knowing. The mayor showed up halfway through and declared it Herald Day in the city with an official proclamation and everything, while I stood there crying, watching all these people whose lives he changed. Bianca sat in a car across the street the whole time, just watching through the window, but never came inside and drove away when people started leaving. 2 days after that, Victoria tried to run and got caught at JFK Airport with $2 million cash stuffed in 3 suitcases and a fake passport with the name Sarah Sarah Mitchell, plus documents showing she'd been planning this escape for months. The judge was so mad about her trying to flee that he revoked her bail completely and ordered her held in federal custody until trial for murder, fraud, and racketeering charges that could put her away for life. The next week, I sat in a law office conference room while 17 different families joined a civil lawsuit against Whitmore Pharmaceuticals and watched on my phone as their stock price dropped 78% in one day, making the company basically worthless. The board of directors held an emergency meeting that lasted 6 hours, then fired every single executive and put out a statement saying they'd cooperate fully with all investigations and compensate victims. 4 days later, on day 62, I was packing up Grandad's house when Bianca showed up at the door, looking like she'd lost 20 pounds with dark circles under her eyes and her hands shaking when she knocked. She stood there for a minute before saying she didn't know what her mom had been doing, that she thought it was just business complaints, and then pulled out a check for $50,000 from her trust fund and left it on the porch saying it wouldn't bring him back, but maybe it could help somehow. The next week, the pharmacist whistleblowers testified to the grand jury, and one of them completely broke down crying while describing how Victoria had threatened to destroy her whole family if she didn't change an elderly man's heart medication to something that would speed things along, and that man had died 3 months later. After that testimony, I couldn't go into pharmacies anymore because the smell made me throw up, so Mia had to pick up my prescriptions while I started seeing a therapist twice a week who kept telling me it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't stop thinking about how Grandad suffered for months because I'd been friends with Bianca. Linda flew back from Switzerland on day 67 with a laptop full of recordings she'd secretly made of her mother over the years, including one from a dinner party where Victoria literally said old people were just resources being wasted, and she was doing society a favor by recycling their assets. The FBI agent who listened to all the recordings told me they'd discovered Victoria's network went way beyond Connecticut into 12 different states where she'd been training other pharmacy owners in her method of slowly poisoning elderly patients while stealing their Medicare benefits. They arrested 19 more people that week, including 3 doctors and 6 pharmacists, plus an insurance executive who'd been helping cover up the suspicious death patterns. The lead FBI agent sat with me in Grandad's empty house and said my grandfather had saved potentially hundreds of lives by keeping those records, because without his evidence, they never would have uncovered this whole network of people killing old folks for money. 3 days later, the detective called while I was packing up Grandad's kitchen plates and told me they'd broken into a safe hidden behind a fake wall in Victoria's office. Inside were 43 folders with old people's photos stapled to the front, and each one had medical records and bank statements and surveillance photos of them going to doctor appointments. The detective's voice got real quiet when he said they found Grandad's folder with a red stamp across it that said, "Completed with obstacle removed," written underneath in Victoria's handwriting. My hand started shaking so bad I dropped the phone and just stood there in his empty kitchen crying. The next morning, some IT guy who used to work for Whitmore came forward with screenshots of this sick program Victoria made him build that would scan through pharmacy records looking for old people worth more than $500,000 with less than $100,000 in savings who only had one person to leave everything to. The program ranked them by how much money they were worth, and Grandad was number 3 on the list. Then this former pharmacy tech called the FBI saying she quit 2 years ago when Victoria asked her to research drugs that would kill old people but look natural, and she kept all the emails where Victoria specifically wanted stuff that wouldn't show up in regular drug tests. I drove to the cemetery that afternoon to tell Grandad about Victoria being denied bail for the 3rd time and how his evidence was helping hundreds of families now. While I was sitting by his headstone, this woman I'd never seen before walked up and said her dad was one of the 7 victims and that Grandad had tried to warn him about the pharmacy switching his pills, but nobody believed him. She thanked me for finishing what Grandad started, and we both just stood there crying together. The medical examiner called that night with the worst news yet because they'd figured out Victoria personally picked the exact combination of drugs that killed Grandad, and she'd been tracking his decline through the pharmacy computer system, so she knew down to the week when he would die. The news reported that Whitmore was filing for bankruptcy, and all their stores would be sold to pay the victims' families, and they were turning the main building into a senior center named after the people Victoria killed. Victoria's personal money, $47 million, got frozen by the court. At her pre-trial hearing, Victoria suddenly stood up and started screaming that old people were going to die anyway, and she just helped speed it up and society should be grateful. Her lawyer tried to say she was mentally ill, but the judge said it sounded more like she was confessing to murder. Linda showed up at my door with a letter from Bianca, who was too ashamed to send it herself, where she wrote about being sorry for how she treated me and Grandad, and how her mom raised her to see people as things to use, and she never knew her mom saw them as things to kill. I spent my last day in Grandad's house before the estate sale, just walking through the rooms that still smelled like his aftershave and coffee. In his desk, I found this photo of him holding me when I was 8 with my parents standing behind us, and on the back he'd written my whole world in his shaky handwriting. I sat on his bedroom floor holding that photo and sobbing until I couldn't breathe. The prosecutor called the next morning saying they'd connected Victoria to 3 old people who died at her first pharmacy job back in the 90s, and they think she's been killing people for 25 years, and the total might be over 100 victims, so now she's looking at life in prison with no chance of getting out. Ray called the next day while I was eating cereal and said they found poison in Grandad's tissue samples they'd saved. It was some custom-made stuff that looked like heart failure, and she'd ordered it months before he died. The arraignment happened 3 weeks later, and Victoria stood there in her orange jumpsuit pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecutor hit play on his laptop, and Victoria's voice filled the courtroom talking about how Harold was almost ready, and she'd have his house to flip soon. She'd recorded herself 2 weeks before he died calling him an old fool who never saw it coming. I threw up in the courthouse bathroom after hearing that. Mia came over the next week to help me pack Grandad's stuff, and we found this old book about World War II that felt weird when I picked it up. Inside was hollowed out with $30,000 in cash, and a note in his shaky handwriting saying he knew something might happen, and this was to fight them and not let them win. He'd signed it, "All my love, Grandad," and called me pumpkin like always, and I just sat there on his bedroom floor crying because he knew he was in danger, but stayed anyway. The FBI agent showed up at my door 2 days later with a folder thick as a phone book, showing Victoria's offshore accounts with $73 million stolen from old people over 20 years. They found this list on her computer called Future Acquisitions, with 200 names of elderly people with property, and every single one got a warning phone call that day. Bianca took a stand on day 90 of the investigation and told everyone how her mom trained her since she was little to make friends with kids whose families had money or property. She was sobbing so hard the judge had to call a recess when she admitted her mom made her become my friend, specifically because Grandad owned that house. The actual trial started 2 weeks later, and I was the first witness, and Victoria stared at me the whole time with this look like she wanted to kill me right there. When I talked about finding Grandad's papers in the basement, she actually smiled, which made the jury all turn to look at her. I wonder if Victoria kept smiling because she thought Harold's papers would never be enough evidence, but then how did all those other pharmacy workers find the courage to testify against someone so scary? Linda went up next with this old notebook from when her mom was in pharmacy school, and it had all these notes about experimenting with drug combinations that could hurt old people. She'd written stuff about thinning the herd and resource redistribution, like she was planning this her whole life. Day 3 of the trial brought 12 pharmacists who all told the same story about Victoria threatening them and making them change prescriptions. One guy had secretly recorded her saying if he didn't increase Mrs. Williams's dose, his daughter wouldn't get into any college in the state. The prosecutor saved the worst for last and played this video from Victoria's own security camera, showing her at her desk with Grandad's medical files spread out. She was talking to herself about 3 weeks at this level, then increased by 40% for heart failure by week 8, and she called it perfect. The jury only needed 3 hours to come back with guilty on everything, including 18 murders and 43 attempted murders and 127 counts of fraud. Victoria didn't even blink when they read it, but Bianca was crying so hard her sister had to hold her up. The judge called for order and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but those 14 days dragged like months with reporters camping outside my apartment and calling non-stop about interviews I kept refusing. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed again with families holding photos of their dead relatives, and when the judge walked in, everyone went silent like we were all holding our breath together. He looked straight at Victoria and started reading from his papers about how she'd turned medicine into murder and betrayed the most sacred trust between pharmacist and patient, and then he said the words we'd all been waiting for, that she was getting life without parole plus 400 years consecutive for each victim. Victoria just smirked as they put her in shackles and led her away, while Bianca collapsed completely and had to be carried out by bailiffs. Outside the courthouse, 43 families surrounded me with their photos, and this woman Maria grabbed me in the tightest hug, saying my Grandad had saved her aunt who was on Victoria's list for the next month. 3 days later, Grandad's lawyer called saying there was something else, and when I got to his office, he handed me a key to a safety deposit box I never knew existed. Inside was a letter in Grandad's shaky handwriting that said, if I was reading this, then I'd done it and stopped them, and he was so proud of me, and to please live my life and not let the darkness define me, and it was signed Love Always. The Whitmore assets got frozen, then distributed to victims' families, with each getting between $500,000 and $2 million, depending on their losses, and when they asked what I wanted to do with Grandad's portion, I told them to use it for a free pharmacy for old people, which we named Harold's Haven. Linda asked to meet for coffee a week later, and she looked so different without all the designer clothes, just wearing jeans and a sweater, and she told me she was in therapy and planning to become a social worker to help protect the people her mother hurt. She pulled out this old photo from her bag that showed Grandad teaching her class in elementary school, and she said he was the only adult who was ever kind to her when she was little, and she'd kept it hidden all these years. I went back to the hospice to thank the nurses, and the director showed me they'd created new rules called the Harold Protocol to protect patients from drug companies trying to exploit them, and they'd put a plaque on his old room that said, Harold's room, where love conquered greed. My phone buzzed with a message from Bianca saying she was moving to Oregon to start over, and would spend her life trying to make up for what her family did, and that my Grandad was a hero, and so was I, and she was sorry she'd been too broken to see it, and she'd donated her whole trust fund to help old people. Mia helped me move into a small apartment near the law school I'd enrolled in, because watching those lawyers fight for justice had shown me what I wanted to do with my life, and we put Grandad's photo on the mantle where I could see it every day. Some nights I'd hear his voice in my head, but now it wasn't scary, just comforting, like he was still cheering me on, saying that's my girl, keep fighting the good fight. 4 months after the trial, I went to Grandad's house, which was mine now, and started planting tomatoes in his garden with all the old neighbors helping and telling stories about how he'd fixed their roofs, or driven them to doctor appointments, or brought them groceries when they were sick. Mrs. Patterson mentioned she'd seen him going through pharmacy records 2 years ago, asking questions about certain medications, but he'd stopped when he got sick, and she realized he'd been trying to protect them even then. 6 months after everything ended, I stood at a podium in front of 300 people at a conference about elder abuse, telling them about a retired teacher who wouldn't stop fighting to protect his community, even when he was dying. After my speech, dozens of people came up with their own stories about suspicious deaths and strange medication changes, and I handed them my new business card from the Elder Justice Task Force, where I worked as an investigator now. The case had changed federal law, with pharmacies facing strict oversight and random audits and special protections for elderly patients, and the FBI estimated Grandad's investigation had saved over 200 lives from Victoria's expansion plans. I wear his watch every day and carry his notebook in my bag, and when I look at the tomatoes growing in his garden or see another elderly person get justice, I know he's still with me in the work we do together. Alright, that was a cool little journey. I had a blast just wondering about stuff and exploring it with you. Really fascinating conversation today. Can't wait to do it again. Like the video, it helps more than you think. Alright, that was a cool little journey. I had a blast just wondering about stuff and exploring it with you. Really fascinating conversation today. Can't wait to do it again. Like the video, it helps more than you think.